Hi everyone. The time has come for us to have another content webinar. I hope you've all started work on the fourth project. As you maybe know, the deadline for that is the 26th of May, so it's about 8 days from now. Um, Apart from being easier than all the others, all the other projects, this project is very important because it shows you an essential part of the life of a front-end web developer, namely testing. So the project is not going to test so much your JavaScript skills to a great extent, like the other projects, but you will be using JavaScript to construct a suite of tests that's actually going to test your own code. So you'll test yourself in this one. So in a way, you will be your own boss, which is great if you ask me. It's essential to get an understanding of how to do this because having the knowledge how to write tests is going to boost your productivity and also the quality of your code ultimately. So um, let me officially welcome you to our 10th content webinar. What we're going to discuss today is not that tightly connected to what we talked about in the previous weeks. So, in the past few weeks, we talked about the inner workings of the JavaScript language. We took a look at some intricate concepts like scope, the this keyword, closures, and a lot of others like DOM, all that. So, it's more than likely that someone else like you will have the skills that you currently possess in your future workplace or in the one that you're in now. And the only way that you're going to get an edge over people like that with similar skills like you is to be more efficient and productive. And last week we took a look at Gulp and how we can automate our developer workflow, and saw that it gives us massive improvements and saves us a lot of time. And today we're going to look at another thing that can enhance our developer workflow, make us more efficient and productive, and that's testing. So one way that developers introduce uh, testing in their workflow um, is to automate some of the is to actually automate the tests and make them uh, test the code so that it saves time for manual testing. Um, so without further ado, actually, let's start. I've made a presentation for you again, which I'm going to share after the webinar. I will also share some resources with you, and actually, let's get going. So let me share the screen, and yeah, let's start. So here's our topic, writing test suites with Jasmine. Just so you know, Jasmine is the tool that you're going to use to test your project. This is our agenda. First off, we'll start by explaining what testing is, why we need it, who does it, the general stuff. After knowing what testing actually is, we'll take a look at the impact of testing. There's a ton of research online about testing, and as a software topic, it is closely scrutinized by a lot of people. Some claim that there is no need to test. Others claim that without testing, there is no way you can end up with a fully functioning product. I won't take a side in this debate, however. Um, these kind of debates tend to be endless. But we'll take a look at some figures about testing, and I think you'll be surprised at how much of a difference testing makes, actually. Um, After that, we'll take a look at what testing is in front-end development specifically. As you know, we are aspiring front-end developers, so we'll take a look at what testing is for front-end development specifically. Um, Bear in mind that testing is done for all kinds of software and not just front or back-end development. But as I said, we're just gonna take a look at the front-end side of things in this webinar. Next, we'll see what types of tests there are. There are a whole bunch of tests that we can perform out there, and our decision depends on which part of our app we want to test, actually. Actually, there's a whole spectrum of tests that can be performed, and we'll take a look at what this spectrum is and see on which side of the spectrum what tests there are. For front-end development specifically, there's a hugely popular concept called the front-end testing pyramid, which is solely dedicated to front-end testing. And we're also going to check that out, see what it is. After that, we'll see how to construct the testing plan for testing our application. As you know, planning is very important in software development, and we also have to create a sub-plan for testing specifically. Testing comes with its own software, and we call that software testing tools. Don't worry, these tools are not that complex. Pretty much all of them look largely the same, and most of them do exactly the same thing, but with very small differences. So the bulk of them are very easy to get into and start using immediately. Actually, the one you'll be using for your project, Jasmine, is built entirely on JavaScript, which you're already familiar with, so it will be easy for you to quickly get going. So after looking at these tools, I'm going to share with you some tips for writing better tests for your front-end applications. And finally, as always, I have listed a few resources on the web for obtaining a more thorough understanding of these fundamental concepts we'll address in a minute. Okay, so let's start. Firstly, let's have a general conversation of what testing is. All right, so testing is code that checks that the code you've written works as expected. Um, Essentially, a test is just simple code that you would normally write, but its focus is to test code that you've already written. And that's the general idea of testing. It's all about testing yourself if what you expect your code to produce is actually the result of what your code is doing. So you've been doing small scale testing yourself during your projects. Maybe you don't know that, but you have actually. Um, yeah. The result, yeah, okay. Take a for loop, for example. It takes in an array, maybe, and loops over all its elements and calls a function we have previously defined that checks a specific part of these elements and only returns true if the condition of this function is matched. If you think about it, this is actually a test. It tests all the array's elements for a certain characteristic, and only if an element matches that characteristic or it possesses that characteristic, it passes the test. So it turns out that you have been implementing testing on a small scale, even if you don't know you've been doing so. And generally, testing is a whole bunch of if else statements. as you'll see, and a bit of for loop there, so not that complicated. Now, I think that you most probably came across this term, test-driven development, or TDD, as it's abbreviated. Actually, test-driven development is an ambiguous topic in the world of software development. Some people have a definition for it, which does not necessarily match what others think when you mention test-driven development to them. Knowing this, we'll take a look at the definition, which you may not fully agree with now or in the future, but we have to start somewhere and kind of understand what test-driven development is. Here, the definition says that test-driven development is a specific methodology of testing. So it's not testing itself. Um, it's a methodology, a technique, so to speak. So in TDD, test-driven development, tests are what drive the design and structure of the code of our projects, of our products or projects or whatever. This means that in order to practice test-driven development, you have to know the product inside out. So you have to know what you want to build. Um, you have to know all the details and have a clear notion of what exactly you want to build, how you want to build it, how it should look like. So essentially, you're writing code that is going to test code that you will write in the future. I know it sounds kind of weird, but if you think about it for a second, it actually makes sense. Implementing test-driven development will allow you to implement the best practices you already have learned about front-end development in general. It will force you to structure your code into smaller components, which are more reusable. It will make your code generally more legible and functional. Most developers actually start out by making the feature that they're working on simply work and function the way that they want. And only once they've achieved this, they jump back and refactor the code to make it more concise. That's essentially doing the same thing two times, and it takes a valuable time off of the development flow. If, however, you have set a test for this feature beforehand, you can't just make the feature work without writing clear and concise code. The test actually forces you to find the best solution, and that can lead to a reduced time spent refactoring the code. That said, test-driven development is a very good thing, but in my opinion, it's suitable for more large-scale projects where you have a team that is dedicated specifically to testing. Um, when you're on your own and not building that much of a complex project, you will spend more time figuring out exactly what type of tests you need than you're going to save because you have these tests. So when you're thinking of using test-driven development, take the time to really think about it, really think about the project, its needs. If you're just developing a simple one-page or two-page app that doesn't do much complex things, you're probably off just writing the code, and after that, um, for writing the test suites that your tests will be comprised of. So yeah, definitely check that. Uh, Check test-driven development out. It's a useful technique, but use it with caution. Now that we know what testing is, let's see some numbers. These numbers I found them online that illustrate the benefits that you gain if you implement testing. So now that we know what testing is, let's actually see if testing is any good and what kind of benefits we can expect if we use this additional functionality. So this is the impact of unit testing. Unit testing is a type of testing. So unit tests are one type of tests, which we'll look at in a bit. But for now, let's just look at what kind of benefits we can expect from unit testing. As you can see, these are statistics that I got from the web page from the link right down here, this long link. Um, these are figures of a company that are compared to the same figures before introducing testing. So after introducing testing, there was a 21% decrease in test defects, an almost 3 times decrease in bugs reported by customers, and a massive 10 times increase in the customer base. So this company decided to implement testing in its development workflow by using unit tests and got these incredible results. Now, I'm not trying to say that all of these statistics are simply caused by the introduction of unit tests, but I think a considerable part of them can be attributed to testing. In the PDF file below in the link, you can see a detailed analysis of how these figures came to be if you're interested. Now, accessibility, as you know, is a very important topic in general, and it's no different in the world of software and front-end development actually as well. There's a big chunk of the nano degree content that deals with accessibility, and I think it does a pretty good job of showing you why exactly accessibility is important for us and why we should try to implement accessibility in our projects as much as we can. The paramount idea behind the internet world is to be accessible to everyone, everywhere, and that goes for people that have disabilities as well. There's a whole school dedicated to making websites available to users with physical deficiencies, and research is conducted every day to aid us in doing so. For developer teams that take accessibility seriously, there are accessibility tests designed specifically to test if the website a disabled user is viewing still provides a pleasant experience. So there are accessibility tests that are designed specifically to test the impaired people and how they interact with your website. According to WHO, which is an organization that deals with accessibility, there are 285 million people worldwide who, due to some disability, so they're suffering with low vision or something like that, cannot read all content on a website. Actually, 39 million of those people are blind and cannot access any of the content via site. So there are actually a good number, 39 million people exactly, that cannot view the website at all. Additionally, there are 360 people suffering from hearing loss worldwide. So 360 million people worldwide cannot hear whatever you have as audio on your website, if there is any. So these numbers are huge, and to better integrate these users, we should write accessibility tests. Here are some of the results after introducing the accessibility tests. So 71% of the disabled in Britain use the web to get information on a product and to do research. Actually, after implementing accessibility tests, the search traffic in Google increased by 50%, and actually two-thirds of the maintenance costs is forgone. These are huge benefits, and accessibility tests, as you can see, can help us provide a better experience for the users with disabilities, and also save us a lot of money in maintenance costs and actually increase our traffic. So including users that have some kind of disability does not only burden us, so to speak, to write additional code, but it also allows us to provide these people with means to get on the internet and access the information that they desire. And also, they actually gain us traffic as well, which is also good for us. So it's a win-win situation. Okay, so of course, there are performance tests as well. In today's world of sophisticated hardware, we have no excuse to write software that performs poorly or is slow in any way. Speed is essential nowadays, and we can write tests to ensure that our app or website or whatever is sufficiently fast to be a pleasure to use by our users. These statistics here show just how important every second is when a page is loading. Just a single second improvement in loading time accounts for a 27% increase in conversion rate. A 2.4 second increase, boosts conversion by up to 13%, and actually a 3.3 second increase in brings us a 20% increase in conversion rate. These small improvements of a matter of seconds, actually, if you think about it, 1, 2, or 3 seconds is pretty much nothing, but these seconds can actually lead to incredible results, and that actually shows how important performance has become nowadays. So if your site is just a second uh, faster than it currently is, you will gain a lot more users to use your site. And that's why performance tests are really important nowadays. Actually, they're the most important right now because, as you can see, just a few seconds make a huge difference. So, um, hopefully, by now, you're convinced that testing brings us significant benefits and is definitely worth giving it a shot. Now, let's see what testing is in our field of interest, which is front-end web development. As you already know, front-end web development is comprised by three main building blocks. The HTML is the language responsible for the architecture of our website. The CSS is what gives our website the style that we want. And we introduce dynamics and functionality with JavaScript. And being the building blocks of front-end development, these three are what we will be testing in front-end development. As you know, websites have become more and more complex than ever right now, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but the more complex a website is, the harder its maintenance is. And the complexity of the modern websites does not lie in the backend part of it. Servers are pretty much the same and do the same things that they did actually a while ago. It's the front end side of things that is getting more complex every single day. There has been a dramatic shift in functionality from server to client with frameworks like Angular and React introducing amazing complexity to websites. So, as you know, or probably are not familiar by now, Angular is the framework you will be using on your last project, which is the restaurant reviews app. Um, so you will be acquainted with Angular in just a small amount of weeks, and that will be your best friend when you're finishing up your the last project, and which is the last step in your graduation from this degree. Back to the presentation. Also, websites integrate into more services than they have ever before. SAS, which is something I definitely encourage you to check out, has taken off in popularity, which means that you have to deal with third-party services that cause havoc with each other. So most of the times you're using npm libraries that conflict each other and sometimes cause bugs that you're not even aware of or can find. And so that's additional burden for us when we're building our apps. Furthermore, today's websites are expected to be available on more browsers than ever. The mobile market is no longer just smartphones. We've also got tablets, TVs, cars, actually, the Teslas and all those, and more to test on. So, of course, the audience today is more diverse than ever as a result of this. So, kids, seniors have all joined the conversation, along with an increase in worldwide internet coverage, free public Wi Fi. Um, the internet is now for everyone, and that brings more and more users, more and more devices, more and more bugs that can occur, and that's why front end development is getting harder and harder. And with that, there are an untold number of subtle errors that can occur on the front end. So minor CSS changes can throw things off. JavaScript tweaks can break in weird ways, and performance regressions due to unfortunately large images and or ads scripts, third-party services that don't play nicely with each other. All of these things can really cause havoc and cause us to have major headaches and pains. And these actually are just a few of the reasons why we need to test our front-end code. Okay, so now let's look into the types of tests. Like we saw previously, there are separate tests for different aspects of our applications. There are tests for accessibility, for the visual parts, for the HTML, for everything, actually. Uh, Here, we'll just mention all of them briefly, and after that, we'll get into more detail for the more important ones. First off, we have JavaScript unit tests. These are the tests that you will be doing in your project, and we'll look at them in a bit. Next up, you have integration tests, which also we'll take a look at in a bit as well. After that, there are CSS and JavaScript linting tests. which are done most of the time by code editors. What they do is check for any typos in your code to prevent silly typing mistakes that cause pain and lose us time in figuring out what they are. So if you don't have a linting JavaScript framework or npm package in your um, package.json file of your projects, I definitely recommend putting some kind of extension in your code editor to check for typos in your code, because not having a linting software of some kind can really uh, slow you down when you're developing your apps. You need to have something that gives you feedback on whether you're writing the right things or just um, typing some gibberish that the software can't understand, and immediately seeing the big error and getting discouraged. So I definitely urge you to go on the extensions panel of your code editor, whatever it is. It might be Microsoft's Visual Studio Code, it might be Sublime, it might be Atom, it might be Brackets, whatever it is. They all have linting software that can be installed in them. And trust me, that will give you a massive boost in productivity. So definitely go and do that as soon as possible. The benefits are large and it's there for the taking. Back to the types of tests. There are automated browser tests, which we'll also explain later. And we took a look at accessibility tests and how powerful they are. And finally, user tests, which are the most basic testing technique and actually the one you've been using all along. And this simply refers to you manually checking that the code that you've written is doing what you expect it to be doing. So this type of testing or these tests, just simply you write the code, you open the browser up, you know what you want from the code, and check that the code does it. If it does it, then the test passes. If there's an error, the test doesn't pass. And that's what a user test is. So most of the time you're doing this, um, but automating things, as we know, increases our productivity, and we should implement automation whenever we can. Now, the first type of tests that we'll explore in more detail is the unit test. Like I said, this is the test that you have to write for your project. Unit tests is by definition a code that tests a unit. And what is a unit exactly? Well, actually, that depends on the programming language you're using. It can be a function, a module, a package, a class, even an object for languages like JavaScript and Scala. In JavaScript, which you will be testing, it's usually a class or a module. By a module, I mean the NPM sense of the word. So a file with code. Uh, the important thing is that the unit is tested in isolation. This is very important. Um, This is perfect for algorithmic functional stuff, like a function that counts the number of characters in a string, or a class that has a set of validation functions. Also, you could test whether the type of output data that you expect is actually what the code is producing. You might be expecting, for example, a number, but what the code is producing is a string. This is something that most of the time is what hinders our progress with our project. We're expecting one data type, but we're working with another. Um, this is very annoying, and writing these types of tests is the perfect use case to implement these unit tests because preventing these small and annoying mistakes is what boosts our productivity by a large margin. Um, actually, these tests are easy to write because they don't depend on any type of inputs. However, uh, memorize, you really hone this down that these units, so a unit can be a function, an array, or an object, you must test this specific unit. It must not interact with any other unit in the test. In your code, it can interact with everything basically, but when you're writing a unit test for it, you should test it in isolation. There should be no other unit that's interacting with it during the test. Um, actually, you may uh, write hundreds of these unit tests because they're simple to write and are pretty fast. So this is because they just test a simple unit, and testing a simple unit is quick. So you can have as many unit tests as you want, but just remember that you must test a simple unit in isolation. So we've seen that unit tests simply test a specific unit of our app in isolation. Integration tests, however, test how two or more units interact with each other. And that, actually, in a nutshell, is what integration tests are all about. They test how a unit behaves when it depends or actually interacts with another unit. So no longer do you have a simple unit in isolation, you have multiple units that perform some kind of interaction or are part of some kind of process in our application. You have much less integration tests than unit tests because these are much slower than the unit tests, and also um, there can't be that many units that interact with one another. Um, so that's why you don't end up with so much integration tests. But definitely, integration tests are something that um, you should write for your projects because testing how units of your code interact with one another is very important. And the final tests that I want to point your attention to are the end-to-end tests. These are the big ones actually. Usually in an application, you have very little, if any, end-to-end tests. This is because of the scope of the E2E tests, as they are commonly abbreviated. They test out a whole process. Essentially, an end-to-end test is like you um, sitting on your chair, starting up your computer, opening the browser, navigating to your website, and doing some actions to see what happens and checking if the functionality that the app displays is the desired one. End-to-end tests actually are like an assistant that is constantly checking the quality of your code. However, these tests are huge and are very slow and can sometimes take minutes to run, and that's why there should be as little of them as possible in your testing suite. So end-to-end tests are definitely something to look into. They're very useful, but just know that um, introducing this type of test to your application will take a lot of time It will take a lot of planning, and it ultimately it can be very useful, but very costly as well. So definitely make a cost benefit analysis of introducing end-to-end testing in your applications. Um, Now that we know the types of tests, let's look at the testing spectrum. Tests are different in scope and aim, and that's why there is a spectrum that aims to arrange all these tests um, uh, to make our lives a bit easier. This is actually the spectrum in a very narrow sense. Um, the tests here, we took a look at all of them previously, um, are arranged by their scope, as you know now. This means that at one end of the spectrum, here in the upper corner of the slide, um, at this part of the spectrum, there are tests there are there are tests that test very small parts of the code, whereas on the other hand, here down down in the slide, we have end-to-end tests which test pretty much all of the codes. Here, as you can see, the smallest tests are the unit tests because, as we mentioned, they test a very small part of our code, just a simple unit. It can be a simple function, an object, just a simple unit in isolation. The next part of the spectrum is taken up by integration tests, and this is the category of tests that comprises all tests that are not unit tests and are not end-to-end tests. So we can have accessibility tests, CSS and linting tests, all of them are integration tests, and they test out a specific interaction between two units of our code. The next part of the spectrum, and actually the final one down there, down here, are the end-to-end tests. Um, they have the largest scope. Um, they test out pretty much all the application code and are the biggest ones and the heaviest ones. So we have a very small number of them in our testing suite. And as you may remember, we talked about a concept called the front-end testing pyramid, and it's kind of a rule that describes what tests there should be in your test suite in order to fully test your applications. So as you can see, we should have tests that are on the whole length of the testing spectrum we saw previously in order to fully test our application. We should have unit tests for the smaller, more important units of our code. So these should test very important functions that the whole application functionality depends on. We should also test the more important processes in our app with some kind of snapshot tests. And finally, to be sure that our app is an integrated whole, we should have one or two, actually, there can be a bit more, end-to-end tests. And having all of these tests will ensure that our app is robust and runs perfectly. As we know, we should always have a plan when we're constructing some kind of software, and part of that plan should be constructing a sub-plan on how we're going to introduce testing to our development workflow. And here are three of the most essential steps to consider when you're constructing your testing plan. First off, you should choose the tools that you will be using to test your code. It depends on a lot of things like the browser that you're going to test on, your audience, the programming language, and there are other variables as well that we're not going to get into. Um, for your projects, actually, you will be using Jasmine. Like I said, it's entirely based on JavaScript, so you should have no problem getting to grips with it. As a second step, you should set a timeline because spending too much time on testing is not getting you any bonus time saved on actual development. As you know, we are introducing testing to free up more time for actual development than we would have if we tested our code manually. We are automating the testing procedure to not have to manually test our code and to free up time that we can use to actually develop our product. And finally, you should decide what part of your project you want to test. You're pretty much never going to test your whole project, so be sure exactly what part of it you want to test. I mean, you're not going to want to test if an array is an array or a certain variable is a data type. Um, you're most likely be going to test some really complex parts of your code. And that's pretty much it for the testing plan. Three easy steps to consider before writing your tests to ensure that you know what you're doing and what you're doing actually makes sense. Now let's talk about the tools that we have at our disposal for testing our software. Bear in mind, we're not going to talk about them at length. We're just going to mention them. And if you really want to know what each and every one of them are like, I encourage you to go online and see their documentation, see some tutorials. Um, First, as you know, is Jasmine. You know all about it. In the nano degree course, there's a section dedicated to it specifically, and I think that does a pretty good job of explaining what Jasmine is, how it works. So no need to get into the inner workings of that. That's up to you for your project to do on your own, as you know. And if you have any issues with how Jasmine works, don't hesitate to reach out to me and we'll figure it out together. Um, a few of the most popular ones beside Jasmine are Selenium, Browsera, Nido, PageSpeed, and YSlow. So, like I said, we're not gonna describe them in detail here. We'll just mention them. If you want to check those out, I definitely recommend doing so. Um, Most of the time, you'll be using some kind of combination of them and not just one of them. And finally, there are some tips I want to share with you for getting more out of your testing. So there are 6 tips here that I've listed that I think are going to be beneficial to you. As I said before, time management is very important. Um, you should really plan your time ahead and how much time you're going to spend on testing. It's really pointless to spend a lot of time on testing because, again, as I said before, we're trying to free up time for spending on our actual development. And if we're spending loads of times on testing, we're not going to get any benefits for our time in further development. The next thing is to use a headless browser that will surely speed things up. So a headless browser provides automated control of a web page in an environment similar to popular web browsers like, for example, Chrome, Mozilla, all those. but are executed via a command line interface or using network communication. So they are particularly useful for testing web pages as they are able to render and understand HTML the same way a browser would, and also including styling elements such as page layout, color, font selection, and actually execution of JavaScript and AJAX requests, which are usually not available when using other testing methods. The next tip is to render only the DOM elements you need. Also, um, you should isolate your test cases so you can easily locate the bugs. So if you're testing a whole bunch of units and get two or three bugs, you should know where your bugs are, and having them all in a bunch and showing them together on the log will puzzle you more than provide clarity. So if you separate the test scripts, you'll know exactly where the bug occurs. Also, you should write reusable scripts whenever you can to make the regression cycles faster. And finally, actually having a consistent naming structure or convention across your tests uh, or test scripts will help you a lot to locate the tests you want to use. And that's actually pretty much everything I had to tell you. Hopefully, these tips are useful and helpful to you to write better tests. Let's look at some of the resources. Here I've listed three of them. I don't know what happened to the second one. Sorry about that. I will fix it. But I'm gonna send you this presentation, so don't worry. And that's it for the presentation. Hopefully, um, you learned something new. Hopefully, you're enthusiastic about testing. As I said, it's a very important part of front-end development. It can save a lot of time, and it's definitely worth checking out and getting into. I know it can be a bit puzzling at first, but um, it's like anything in front-end development. You have to stick with it to fully understand it. And if you don't initially understand what's going on, if you stick with it, you'll eventually find the sense in all of it. So that's it from me for today. I wish you good luck with the projects. Also, I wanted to mention the GitHub and the LinkedIn profile projects. They are not compulsory to your graduation, but I definitely urge you to check them out and actually have a go at them, because having a good GitHub and a good LinkedIn profile will massively increase your chances of getting employed in the future. And I think that pretty much all of you are here exactly for that. As you know, Udacity's main focus is to equip you with the skills that you need to work as a professional in the field of the nano degree. So finding a job after graduating from the nano degree is the main aim of what actually the nano degree is. So having good GitHub and LinkedIn profiles is very important for you and your job search. Employers tend to look at them at those two platforms every time they consider an employee. So I definitely urge you to check them out. Like I said, the deadline for the feed reader project, your fourth project, is next Sunday. You have 8 days, which is a lot of time for this project. Like I said, it's not that complex. You just need to think ahead, plan your project, and you will be done in surprisingly fast time. Also, the GitHub and the LinkedIn profile projects have the same deadline. So next week, next Sunday, you have a deadline for 3 projects, um, which is kind of intimidating if you don't have started work. So the GitHub and LinkedIn profile projects don't take that much time. I think you will be done quite um, fast with them. And that's actually all I have to tell you for today. Like I said, good luck with the projects. And if you have any questions or need any help, I'm here to help. So good luck with everything and have a good weekend.